Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending our first seminar of our virtual seminar series in the Department of Film, Theatre and Television, University of Reading. My name is Lucia Najib, and I am a professor of film in the department, and I'm also the director of PGR studies, both in the department and in the School of Arts and Communication Design. The current costume here in the department these days is for the DPGR to organize the yearly seminar series. My plan was this year to invite our PhD students to suggest speakers, and I put it under the banner of my hero. So who is my hero in terms of inspirational scholars, inspirational practitioners that had made a big difference in the study of my subject? And among the many names that surfaced in that poll was the name of Professor Melanie Williams, who is about to join us now for the first seminar of our series. And one of the proponents of this fantastic scholar was my dear colleague and friend and PhD student, Claire Gould, who is here. And Claire is helping us in the organization of the series, and in particular, she will be chairing this session today, and she will come on the screen in a minute to do some housekeeping for us and also to conduct the entire talk and Q&A. Okay, so a few words about Claire, and then we will introduce Professor Melanie Williams as well. So Claire is a third-year PhD candidate in our department. Her research is to do with representation of landscape, rurality, and shoreline in popular British cinema of the 1930s. Alongside her main research project, Claire has been co-organizer of the department's PGR conference, JAM, and participates in the videographic workshop that's conducted here in our department. So just to complete the introduction of Claire, Claire was a professional already, but she took a big gap between her working life and coming back to academia. And during that time, she worked on archives of television and film under various hats and roles, including archive producing for documentaries and writing, and doing a lot of metadata for research in film and television. So this is all about Claire. I hope our other students who are in another room and haven't managed to join yet, that they are now with us. That's my hope. And okay, and now it's time to bring to the screen. So let me bring Claire here. Okay. So I was talking about her, but not showing her. And now I'm going to be showing Melanie. So this is our esteemed guest today, Melanie Williams, who is Professor of Film and Television Studies at the University of East Anglia, as well as a freelance writer, public speaker, and consultant on film history. She is the author of the monographs Prisoners of Gender, David Lean, Female Stars of British Cinema, and The Taste of Honey for the BFI Film Classics series, as well as numerous articles, and co-author of Transformation and Tradition in 1960s British Cinema with Richard Palmer, Laura Main, and Duncan Petrie. And this drew on the AHRC-funded project of the same name. Her current book project is a study of the British filmmaker Muriel Box, about whom she will be speaking today, for publication with the BFI Bloomsbury Classics series, isn't it? So Muriel Box, The Truth About Women and the Truth About Women Directors is the new book that she will be publishing. And her talk today is precisely that, addressing Muriel Box's 1957 film, The Truth About Women. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Claire and disappear from the screen, hoping that those who were on the wrong link have now joined us.
Okay. Yes, I'd also just like to welcome Professor Melanie Williams and thank her very much for taking up our invitation. Professor Williams's research into British film has traced a very interesting path between the very well-known subjects and people and those lesser-known films and creatives such as Muriel Box, and indeed the invisible women in amateur and artist filmmaking, with her earlier research into film archiving and the development of a feminist approach to film archive metadata and cataloguing. And this research was where I first came across Professor Williams, as I was working in a film archive at the time and faced many similar issues around uncovering important material and important contributions to film history that were becoming lost in the cataloguing that did not acknowledge those contributions of women and also other marginalised groups. And that's an ongoing concern in archives. And indeed for anyone trying to gain a more complete understanding of our cultural history. So in that spirit of discovery, or possibly rediscovery, I'm happy now to hand over to Professor Williams for her presentation on Muriel Box.
Okay. I'm hoping everybody can hear me all right and see my slides. I hope that's the case.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for such a kind introduction that I really appreciate. As has been outlined, my title of my presentation today is Muriel Box, The Truth About Women and the Truth About Women Directors, although I would stress that I don't think there can be one single truth about women directors, but I'm going to try and use Muriel Box as a way of kind of getting at multiple possible truths. I've also decided to have a subheading because I can't resist, and this comes from the Worcester Evening News from 1964, a woman director, and it all goes smoothly. Okay, so having directed 13 features between 1952 and 1964, Muriel Box remains the most prolific woman director to have worked in mainstream British film production to this day. Somewhat shockingly, perhaps, considering all the illustrious women who've come in her wake, like Sally Potter or Gorinda Chadha. Although Box had the advantage of working in a period in which studio production still provided a regular supply of content for a thriving cinema sector before TV's domination, as well as having great personal drive, more crucially, she had the support of her husband and creative collaborator, writer-producer Sydney Box. He was the facilitator and guarantor, without whom Muriel Box would have struggled to be permitted to move from screenwriting into direction. He had initially masqueraded as her co-director for her first credited feature as director in 1952, so that backers would not be scared off by the prospect of a woman holding the directorial reins solo. 12 years later, he was still having to quell doubts about the feasibility of using a woman director on what turned out to be Box's final film, Rattle of a Simple Man, in 1964. As she later reflected, gender-based doubt about her directorial viability seemed to be an endemic problem. Why can't they give women a chance? They haven't any confidence at all in them. They never say to women, let us try and see what she's done. Right into my last film, which is interesting, they didn't want a woman director on that last one, so Sidney dug his heels in and he said, I'm very sorry. He was approaching the starting date. If Muriel's not going to direct it, I'm afraid I'm not going to make the film. If you don't have support as strong as that, you don't get any jobs. By the 60s, Muriel Box had directed multiple box office hits on top of having won a screenwriting Oscar for the melodrama The Seventh Veil in 1945, but that track record seemed to count for very little. The default assumption that direction was a male preserve meant that Box's skill in that field was frequently regarded with disbelief, as in the Worcester Evening News quotation that I had at the beginning. In certain contexts, a woman directing could not even be acknowledged as a possibility. Box recalled her agent, Christopher Mann, telling her about the results of his attempts to get Hollywood executives interested in employing her in the 1950s. I wish I could tell you different, but if I mention the name of a woman as a director, they just turn away and look out of the window. No wonder then that Muriel Box, one of a very small number of women directing in post-war British cinema, felt continually professionally precarious and perpetually anomalous, labelling herself an odd woman out in the title of her autobiography. Reputationally, she was arguably at a double disadvantage as a British woman director. Firstly, as noted by numerous writers, emergent auteurism of the post-war period was very much enthralled to that idea of the auteur director as heroically virile, imposing his own masculine personality on whatever material he'd been allocated to direct. This is not accidental, it's a foundational component of the auteur identity. And this gendered template for directorial greatness severely limited the intellectual space available for giving serious concern to the small number of women directing in international film at this time. Moreover, Box had the misfortune to be working within a national cinema frequently deemed the bad object in auteurist discourse, in formative texts being written in the US, in France, and in Britain itself. In Movie's infamous directorial talent histogram, she was in the least distinguished category of all, the rest, a kind of miscellaneous catch-all. The situation was hardly much better a few years before when Box had been included in Sight and Sound's index of currently working British directors, only to receive the gendered faint praise or backhanded compliment of having her films homogenised as, for the most part, women's pictures, part of the magazine fiction of the screen, and no less competently organised than most magazine fiction. Arguably, Box's reputation still suffers from the long tail of such influential critical dismissals, due to being British and a woman director. And my aim is to bring Box and her valuable films into a position of greater visibility that they deserve, following Christine Battersby's principle that we can only reinstate women creators in cultural history when we pay them the compliment of treating their works with the care and respect that we accord to the individuality of white males. There are obviously problems with this approach, since film authorship, as Judith Mayne notes, risks appropriating for women an extremely patriarchal notion of cinematic creation. But here again, Battersby's pragmatism in appropriating the vocabulary of genius for feminist ends is galvanizing. Since we can't stop journalists or popular historians from using the word genius, we have to join in and project our own artistic values by picking out female geniuses, all the while adapting and transforming what that word might encompass. This is the approach I choose to take towards Muriel Box and her film authorship, strategically leaning into rather than resisting the blandishments of auteurist discourse to provide a feminist corrective to its previous gender biases. One thing Muriel Box was particularly keen to do in her films was to explore and express elements of her feminism. This allegiance was born partly of personal experience, partly from autodidactic learning. Box later stated that reading Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own made such an impact on me in my 20s that I have been possessed ever since with a strong urge to support the cause of equality between the sexes. Although she lamented that she had not been old enough to be a suffragette, she still hoped to use film as a parallel vehicle for cultural disruption. Unable to chain myself to the railings, I could at least rattle the film chains. Box's feminist ethos can be discerned throughout all her film work, but she herself thought it was best expressed in her 1957 film The Truth About Women, which she originated, co-scripted and directed, and was later described as the film of hers personally significant to me above all others. Therefore, I focus on this exemplary film in this presentation, exploring the insights it provides into Box's tactics for making a feminist intervention into post-war gender politics in the form of a commercially viable film project able to reach mainstream audiences. In production, it was well supported. It was her 8th feature, the most expensive picture she'd directed so far, in colour with 40 sets and a star-studded cast dressed by Cecil Beaton with a budget of $183,000. However, its checkered pathway to distribution provides an instructive case study of a feminist filmmaker's struggles with an at best indifferent and at worst actively hostile industry. The Truth About Women thereby reveals multiple truths about women in film, both on screen, through Box's portmanteau presentation of multiple female predicaments, and off-screen, through what it reveals about the subaltern status of female filmmakers' projects, a specific truth about women directors, for whom things rarely went smoothly. Muriel Box's desire was to take mainstream audiences with her on a feminist journey and to be persuasive rather than confrontational in her approach, trying to build consensus and meet people halfway, and this is evident from even the briefest outline of The Truth About Women. The film deals with the romantic reminiscences of English diplomat Humphrey Tavistock, played by Lawrence Harvey, from his lovelorn peregrinations in Edwardian youth to his present-day old age. Humphrey recalls in flashback the many women he's been involved with throughout his life, providing a nostalgic framework of period romance and a young man's sentimental education that was generically familiar, drawing on established literary genres. In terms of genre, its primary allegiances were to the comedy of manners and elements of bedroom farce, prompting one promotional tagline, "You'll laugh at the spicy adventures of a romantic young man." And this kind of scene of bedroom farce that you can see on the screen of the French maid interrupting the kind of love scene is typical, at least of certain parts of the film. However, Box deliberately deploys the male protagonist's love life as a pretext for exploring what really interests her, which is, in her words, the status of women in various societies from the turn of the century until today, presented through the film's various vignettes centered on each of Humphrey's loves in their various situations. These women offer an international array of female experience shared within varied cultures, classes, and customs, from Diane Cilento's free-thinking suffragette Ambrosine to Jackie Lane's exoticized servant Saida, Eva Gabor's sophisticated Frenchwoman, Lisa Gastoni's rapacious American, Julie Harris's talented artist, and Maya Zetterling's noble nurse. Their characterization may initially lean into female stereotypes, but Box's approach is essentially deconstructive, investigating what might lie behind each cliche. I've compared it to the Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which has all the women played by one actress, Deborah Kerr. This is a kind of opposite way of approaching this idea of a man kind of in old age looking back at his romantic life and all the women being very different. There is no common woman, just as there is no common female experience, the film suggests. Rather, there are multiple women, multiple experiences, multiple truths, albeit linked by parallel or overlapping systems of women's subjection, which it's Box's feminist objective to illuminate and investigate. Although the film's handling of its subject matter is often avowedly and explicitly feminist, the pill is sugared not only by its anchoring in a male protagonist story, but also by the provision of visual pleasure, including the beautiful colour cinematography of Otto Heller, which renders the superbly dressed sets and heritage locations, as well as Cecil Beaton's very chic period costumes in beautiful detail. The costumes provided inspiration for fashion tie-ups in the film's campaign book, which also repeatedly emphasised the production's star-studded cast, an international assembly of star talent, as a prime attraction. Along with the pleasures of stardom, the promotional campaign foregrounded the pulling power of the film's provocative title, suggesting ways of creating publicity buzz by having different celebrities, including the film's stars, state what they felt was the truth about women, and playing on the differences in their responses. Both the poster and the trailer present the film as a site of revelatory disclosure about sexual politics. The trailer's captions include truth will out, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Will any woman admit it to any man? A film like this offered a rare space in which Muriel Box's gender as director could be mobilised advantageously as a woman herself, divulging authentic knowledge. Within Box's strategically conspiratorial, conciliatory and pleasure-centred approach to making a feminist film, she nonetheless embeds moments of sharply suggestive critical engagement with the complexities of female subjectivity and feminine mythology. This begins from the film's opening credits, which play out over the famed Velázquez painting known as the Rokeby Venus, a female nude often seen to exemplify the male gaze in fine art, which had been slashed in an attack by militant suffragette and later fascist Mary Richardson in 1914. An event narrated in Leslie Ann Barrett's 1982 feminist short film, An Epic Poem. The painting depicts a nude female figure with her back to the spectator, enabling unchallenged contemplation of her beautiful naked form. Meanwhile, she contemplates her own face reflected blurrily in a cherub-held mirror. As such, it is absolutely emblematic of the patriarchal representational practices in fine art, scornfully described by John Berger. You painted a naked woman because you enjoyed looking at her. You put a mirror in her hand and you called the painting vanity. thus morally condemning the woman whose nakedness you had depicted for your own pleasure. The real function of the mirror was otherwise. It was to make the woman connive in treating herself as, first and foremost, a sight. Truth About Women amplifies these ideas of woman as spectacle by choosing to reveal the painting between slowly parting red velvet curtains like a theatrical display, but also a bit like a peep show, a form of feminine display hinging on titillating forbidden sights. To have a woman director mobilizing such an image as the opening shot of her film, purporting to disclose the truth, is intriguing in the ironies and nuances it entails. Whose truth about women is this film going to present? The truth of male perceptions of women, as John Berger suggests of this kind of imagery? Or a deeper truth about what it feels like to exist within that framing, to internalize its constraints, and in John Berger's formulation, to continually watch oneself while being looked at? All of the interlocking complexities of gendered optical politics are generated by this choice. This tone of playfulness and feminism continues in the film's early sequences, detailing Humphrey's formative encounters with Ambrosine, a free-thinking young woman who lives independently and refuses to kowtow to convention. She proposes that they live together for a year before getting married, in a register office, not a church. When Humphrey frets over what this will mean for her reputation, she asks him, well, what about yours? Humphrey's response that it's different for a man fails to convince her. She replies, well, it shouldn't be. I'm quite prepared to live by the same standards as you. The screenplay immediately sets out its interrogative approach to women's place in society, using calm, adversarial dialogue to subject received wisdom to scrutiny. Events intervene to prevent that relationship from coming to fruition at this point. Humphrey moves on to his next love, Saida, a servant girl he encounters during his first diplomatic posting in an imagined Middle Eastern country called Yakrut, Turkey backwards. When Saida is sold to the Sultan's harem at a slave market, Humphrey resolves to rescue her, hence the brown face makeup that we can see him wearing in this production still. Outraged by such barbarism in the treatment of women, Humphrey is nonetheless upbraided by the Sultan for his assumed Western superiority. He says, I studied the tenets of your law and your religion. I found them most extraordinary. Have you the opportunity of studying ours? Then perhaps you should. If we are to use such words as barbaric, I must tell you that your marriage customs appear the most barbaric of all. The truth about women's emphasis on questioning received wisdom from a standpoint of cultural relativism continues as Humphrey experiences a fresh code of ethics around male-female relations, equally strange to him on his next ambassadorial posting in Paris. Here, the tacit acceptance of marital infidelity is the source of his bewilderment and eventual misadventure, accidentally flouting the rules and being challenged to a duel. Another vignette in the film prompts comparison with Saida's position under Yakruti law through a parallel legal case in the English court system centred on the market value of a woman. By now middle-aged, Humphrey has fallen in love again, this time with Julie, a Scandinavian nurse who helped him recover from injuries sustained in World War I combat. He wants to marry her, but finds out that her estranged husband is still alive. The husband takes her to court for desertion, mainly in the hope of extracting a large payment from Humphrey for stealing his property. Always a filmmaker attentive to legal questions and courtroom scenes, Box uses the setting of the English courtroom as a space in which Julie's position can be contextualized and broadened into a broader feminist consideration of a woman's monetary worth. And there are various discussions of precedents of men selling their wives, using kind of real life information as humorous, but at the same time, deftly instructive evidence. The point is made, what had appeared to be the shocking cultural difference of the Ukruti slave market exchanging women as men's property is actually a form of barbarism equally close to home, with clear domestic analogues. I want to turn now, however, to the section of the film detailing Humphrey's marriage to a young artist, Helen, played by Julie Harris. After a meet cute in a stuck lift, the couple get together, get married, and soon her art career is subsumed by the demands of keeping house and raising the children that come in quick succession during Humphrey's lowly diplomatic posting in Prague. Their happy marriage lasts a little over 5 years as Helen dies in childbirth, giving birth to twins. A few days later, unaware of this, the art dealer that she almost married once arrives to inquire about Helen's latest work. He's become increasingly convinced that perhaps she is one of the great ones. Humphrey permits him to look through the few canvases left behind, each one showing great colourful potential, but apologetically annotated with Helen's explanations for their incomplete or damaged state due to child-rearing responsibilities, sometimes quite literally. So in an earlier scene, we see one of her children put her head through one of the canvases and create a great hole in the middle. So the annotations run, Susan had measles. Before I could finish it, Catherine arrived. And most poignantly of all, I shouldn't have begun it. The twins will arrive quicker than I can finish it. The camera tracks in towards these hastily composed messages from a woman now dead, intercutting between each sad truncation of a potential masterpiece and the devastated reaction of the art dealer, who confides to Humphrey, "You know, it is as though this morning I had discovered Cézanne. Tonight he is dead." The inspiration of Woolf's A Room of One's Own seems especially clear here, especially Woolf's instructive fable of the fate of Shakespeare's sister, equally talented but lacking the societal pathways to make possible the full expression of that genius, and dying tragically young. Helen functions as a kind of Cézanne's sister, not lost to desperate suicide like Woolf's Shakespeare's sister, but having her major creative potential that could have seen her be one of the great ones, curtailed by the caring responsibilities attendant on wifedom and motherhood, however freely and joyfully undertaken. The art dealer informs Humphrey of the contingency of artistic potential being fulfilled. One looks, one waits, one hopes, a little flame. Perhaps one day it will grow into a great conflagration. Perhaps a puff of wind will blow it out. But Muriel Box, both in her writing and direction of this scene, leaves us in no doubt that the creative woman is far more susceptible to having her talent extinguished by the many competing claims on her time and attention. This powerful moment in The Truth About Women is not only poignant in terms of the narrative, but stretches beyond its immediate context into a broader statement on the interrupted, frequently thwarted creative careers of women. The end of the film shows us Humphrey reunited in old age with the suffragette Ambrosine. And she is the character who firmly delivers what feels like the film's core message in response to a misogynist, hothead son-in-law who says that women don't seem to want to be women anymore. She says, no, they want to be women, all right. They just have a different definition of what the word means. To a woman, it means a person, an equal partner in the business of life, free to do what is right and best for herself. Her words are tactically counterbalanced with a more lightweight shrug of a statement from Humphrey as to the real truth about women. It's hell living with them, but it's a damn sight worse having to live without them. This gentle piece of male-female dialectic still reverberates as the argument between the younger couple continues and the affectionate older couple are left looking on ruefully. An appropriately gentle and conciliatory final image for a project aiming to stealthily smuggle feminist ideas into a mainstream British film comedy without causing undue alarm. Triumphantly realised by Muriel Box and her collaborators. Turning to Box's diaries, we can see that shooting on The Truth About Women lasted from the 18th of March 1957 through to the 29th of May that year, just over 10 weeks in total, after which Box declared herself exhausted and relieved. By the 6th of June, editor Anne V. Coates, later to cut Lawrence of Arabia, as well as many other celebrated films, had assembled a rough edit of the film. Feeling upbeat and ebullient at the successful completion of the project, Box began work on a companion piece in September of that year, provisionally titled The Truth About Men. However, such creative dynamism was not to be sustained. Box began 1958 under duress, personally and professionally. Her elderly mother was unwell and required care and attention, and familial responsibilities usually impinge more on women, with Box being no exception. She struggled with attendant frustrations, as she wrote in her diary in January of that year. I have periodic fits of depression as I am unable to settle down into any interesting work. Nursing and housekeeping failed to satisfy my mental needs. Then, The Truth About Women's backer and distributor, British Lion, having initially given their full support to this production, suddenly appeared to get cold feet about it. They took the decision not to give the film a press screening nor a premiere in London's West End, both standard practice at that time for the release of an A picture. As Box would later write in her autobiography, it was tantamount to crying stinking fish in advance to exhibitors all over the country. On the 15th of January 1958, devastated and distraught at what amounted to the burying of her film, Box wrote to David Kingsley, the managing director of British Lion. The archive preserves her draft letter, making it possible to see her editorial process in writing such a heartfelt communication, while trying to maintain a measured tone, swapping what hurts most of all to the more neutral what makes me most unhappy. Her hope that you are proved wrong to one that our picture turns out better than you had expected, and exchanging the statement that you have no confidence in our picture to a passive-aggressive apology for having landed you with a problem picture. Not wanting to efface entirely the emotional impact of British Lion's decision, Box still chose to sign off the letter, yours, bloody and bowed. 2 days later came a confidential response from Kingsley, evasive and somewhat patronising in tone, and addressed to Mrs. Sidney Box, not the name she wrote to him under, and therefore seemingly a pointed choice. He wrote, "We do not feel that your picture has presented us with any grave problem, unless, of course, we take the view that every film is a problem. Every film is a challenge, and each case we have to give the thought to the best way of handling it. Press notices do little positive good and can do some harm. There's no point, therefore, in press showing a film." This reply left Box feeling, as she admitted to her diary, more depressed than ever. "I've lost heart about my future, no confidence in anything I'm concerned with." As she later recounted, Box prepared herself stoically for the film to disappear without trace once it had been released. In the run-up to its February 58 release, she noted in her diary that other than one small advert in a single Sunday paper, there has not been a shred of publicity for the picture anywhere in London. But in the end, it would be the critics who came to the film's rescue, paying for admission at one of the few London cinemas where it was showing in the absence of a press screening. Their response was overwhelmingly warm and appreciative, with, for instance, Peter Burnup in the News of the World unhesitatingly declaring it Choice of the Week for its Edwardian elegance and witty dialogue, and Alan Dent of the London Illustrated News admiring the smoothness and fleetness of genuine light comedy, while Cecil Wilson in the Daily Mail called it well worth investigating, and Margaret Hinksman in Picturegoer deemed it vastly entertaining. Reviewers also took the opportunity to express their puzzlement as to its rather surreptitious appearance in the remoter reaches of London cinemas, making it look like some black sheep of the family, as Milton Schulman put it. Perhaps the truth about women is something that the producers want to keep secret, although I cannot imagine why, pondered Philip Oakes in the Evening Standard. Across the publication spectrum, critics made clear that they thought the film had been unfairly treated. From Isabel Quigley in The Spectator wondering why, with so much nasty nonsense press shown and publicised, it should be bundled away so darkly, and Harold Conway in the Daily Sketch, wondering why far less funny specimens had been ballyhooed into Leicester Square. The strongest statement of support and solidarity came from Leonard Mosley, film critic for the top-selling British broadsheet newspaper of the time, the Daily Express. His review, subheaded, "Boy, Am I Enthusiastic?" not only praised the film fulsomely, but also called out British Lion's decision-making. Sometimes the mental processes of the men who book films for Britain's cinemas baffle, bewilder, or infuriate me. What happens when a good comedy like The Truth About Women comes along? It goes on general release next week without even having had the benefit of the slap-up premiere which it so richly merits, while the biggest cinema in the West End is given over to a large, boring and artificial American farce. This British success sneaks out into the world with barely a whimper out of the publicity boys. I had to search it out myself and pay at the box office in order to write this review. This, published on February the 14th, was a wonderful Valentine's gift for Muriel Box, who wrote in her diary that she'd been feeling so rotten after a sleepless night, but had been alerted to this rave review by a friend and asked her husband Sidney to get the paper for her. He was delighted and declared it the best we've had on any picture. She was even happier to have her film mentioned in an Express editorial, bracketing it with Bridge on the River Kwai as fine British films to be seen that week. British Lion director David Kingsley had written to Box again on the 13th of February in response to earlier positive reviews, doubling down on his company's position and claiming the emergent critical esteem as his own triumph. I think our psychology has proved correct, and I believe that seeing the film with a live audience has made a difference. This type of comedy shown to a limited number of highly critical reviewers at 10:30 in the morning does not really stand a fair chance. Seen in a full theatre, it gets the excellent reception which it deserves. I can assure you that we are making the maximum use of this excellent publicity. Box privately dismissed what she saw as a ridiculous letter, trying to justify their attitude. Muriel Box had carefully conceived of and subtly crafted a film aiming to make a feminist intervention without compromising on its commercial appeal, well aware that box office disappointment would disproportionately impact her onward career as an already precarious and risky woman director. The Truth About Women made its salient feminist observations effectively, strategically encasing them within a narrative and aesthetic framework that would be both intelligible and pleasurable for audiences of the period, as critical response indicates. Perhaps the feminist message was a touch too stealthy. It was interesting that in all the critical support that she got, nobody particularly flagged this as a film of kind of feminist political persuasion, but that may have been to its advantage. Of course, all of this will only work if audiences actually saw it, and British Lion's denial of the most basic publicity protocols appeared to have prevented the film from reaching the picturegoers it had been intended for. Box herself latterly suggested that it never completely recovered from its churlish send-off. The boost she received from the film being critically praised and the backlash against British Lion's attitude to it was greatly appreciated, and it helped it recover a little of its commercial potential, but the damage had already been done. The Truth About Women did go on to do reasonable US business upon its art house release there in late 58 and early 59, probably also benefiting from Lawrence Harvey's raised profile through the film Room at the Top. Its stymieing in the British market may have been incidental to it being directed by a woman. Was it easier for British Lion to lose confidence in The Truth About Women because of its directorial provenance, or to justify its withdrawal of customary support on the grounds of low expectations which derived from this? It's impossible to confirm, but one observes that this incident took its place in a pattern of treatment endured by Box as she tried to sustain a meaningful directorial career. It was wounding to her confidence to have a passion project treated in this way. She never got a chance to make a film as personal or as big budget as The Truth About Women again. When her marriage to Sydney Box collapsed in the mid-1960s, it was no longer possible for her to sustain her career in that profession. She moved into publishing instead. Therefore, in many ways, this film was the high watermark and one of the most eloquent expressions of the truth about women that Muriel Box's career ever offered, as well as a truth about the likely ultimate fate of the woman film director. And I'll finish there.
Lucy, you're just muted.
I was collecting questions in my mind and on paper here as I heard your exposition, but I'll just pass on to Claire, who I'm sure has also her own questions, and we are also collecting questions from the audience. And whilst they are still in the process of formulating their questions and posting them on the chat, we will kick off with a Q&A. So if you want to start.
Yes, thank you. I was interested actually that early on you related this film's approach to The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which had also struck me as a reference with this film because of the following the character through different stages of life and different ages. But the two films are never referenced together. And you've explained why this film suffered to find its audience. I wondered, yes, is it your feeling that Muriel Box was something of an outlier here, or can we now see that she's perhaps part of a trend?
Yeah, I think she occupies this position where she is both absolutely in the kind of middle of the British film culture of her period. I mean, she's in the, you know, the various meetings, and so the kind of civic and union stuff that's related to the profession, as well as, you know, making mainstream films that are intended to reach large audiences. But at the same time, she's kind of always going to be positioned in a way that is at one remove. She's always the exception to the general rule, if only because she's a woman director. And at that point, you know, you can count them on the fingers of one finger, probably. You know, there's not many of them about, and she's very clear in acknowledging that this is a position that is partly afforded because she's got someone who's able to kind of go into bat for her in a way that maybe some of her peers don't have. So she's both absolutely within the mainstream, but also always anomalous, always a kind of odd woman out, and talks about also in terms of her personality always feeling slightly kind of a one remove from things in her autobiography. So the odd woman out thing isn't only to do with being the only woman director in the room, it's also a kind of more general feeling, I think, of feeling slightly at one remove from the culture. And I think part of that is the kind of feminist feeling at a time period that's generally seen as one where feminism is not central to the culture in maybe ways that it might be later.
Thank you. And just, if I may, just to follow up on that, that when you look at what the general impression of British cinema in the 50s at this time is, it is very different to the kind of filmmaking that Muriel Box was doing. It's different to The Truth About Women. We tend to think about the new wave films and the social problem films, and indeed the Angry Young Men, which she obviously isn't one of those. So it'd be interesting to hear from you how you've kind of approached telling a slightly different story about the 50s and about what we think about British filmmaking at this time more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, British cinema is towards the end of the 50s is obviously in a kind of a transitional position, and you've got the kind of residual middle class kind of comedy traditions that are still very popular and successful, and then there's a kind of a counterbalance of a slightly more ribald variant on that that's going to take off more with the carry-on films into the sort of 1960s. But then also the kind of realist thread to British films that she had participated in earlier. So she's kind of moving in interesting ways between one genre that she never really wanted to have anything to do with was the war film. And obviously, if you're a filmmaker in Britain in the 50s, one of the most like popular genres is the war film. So she kind of moves between comedy and more kind of realist social problem types. And as she moves into the 1960s, you start to see more projects that feel more kind of new wave adjacent or social problem adjacent, but in many ways they're returning to things that she was doing back in the 1940s when she was working with Sydney at Gainsborough Studios and injecting more of a sense of realism and kind of social engagement. So she kind of moves in these, kind of weaves in and out of, you know, more fantasy related modes, more kind of light comedic modes, and then more kind of perhaps angry, socially engaged modes. Although, of course, comedy is often a very good vehicle for thinking through the sore points of a culture at a given time. And I think she's definitely doing that with her uses of comedy.
Yeah, that's great. I am thinking about the question of then and now. You touched upon that already. What was feminism in the post-war kind of context, and what we would be considering feminism now, and within that kind of line of thought. A question that is so prominent coming already from the title of this film, The Truth About Women, the question of truth, and the question of truth being actually at the heart of the business there, the truth, not the prohibition around expressing truth and compromise from all sides, both from Box herself, but also from the industry. They had to compromise to allow a woman to make films in the mainstream, and she had to compromise. And I loved that letter which you got the proto text from, and how she was amending it so as not to hurt the pride of the producer who was behind it. So the question of truth, and then there would be a follow-up with the truth about men.
Yes.
And because you've done this absolutely amazing research on the correspondence between her and distributors and producers, I wonder if you could give us an insight into what this The Truth About Men would have been, and whether that compromised feminism and auteurism that she was kind of representing continues into that kind of approach to men.
I mean, one of the things that's so interesting, in the archival resources are incredibly rich. The Sydney and Muriel Box collection that the BFI have has got her diaries, lots of correspondence, lots of kind of ephemera paperwork. So it's been a real treasure trove being able to kind of look through those materials. The Truth About Men, we never hear anything more about it. So at one point she's like, I've got this idea for the kind of follow-up, and then it goes completely dead. And I think, you know, largely to do with personal difficulties, but also how discouraged she felt by the treatment of the film. But she does go on to write a really interesting science fiction novel called The Big Switch, which is about a future society in which women have become the kind of dominant sex. And there's a man who's kind of, it's like the sleeper awakes, you know, he's woken up after centuries of being in sleep, wakes up into this female dominated society with interesting consequences. So I wonder if some of the ideas that she might have had in relation to that truth about men may have ended up being refracted through this other project. And at one point she was trying to get funding for a film version of this novel that she'd written, but it just didn't really come to anything. But it's a fascinating novel as a piece of kind of feminist science fiction and a gender switching. It feels, you know, it feels very interestingly connected to some of the other work that she did, but working in a different generic framework that time. So there's wonderful stuff to kind of, when I found that draft letter with her kind of annotations of this is what my first version is, and these are the ways that I have to change it to not look hysterical, to not look hurt, to not look like I'm a harpy. It seemed to me such a powerful demonstration of the way that women have to kind of modify and modulate their tone and their voice, and to hide, things that they feel will disadvantage them through their expression. That was quite a sort of interesting discovery, and to see that editorial process that often in the archive is effaced. You don't get to see the kind of draft version because that will have just been chucked out, and you'll see the final letter that she sent perhaps. But yeah, seeing the work in progress and these competing voices within her own description of how she's going to respond to this terrible thing that's happened. Very, very salutary and fascinating.
Yeah, brilliant. I have a few questions coming in now. The first one by Helen Henson, and she asks, thank you for the brilliant talk, Melanie. You began with the clipping that all goes smoothly in your research into the production process and Muriel Box's diaries. Are there any insights into how she managed the directing or shooting and or post-production, i.e. how did she fit into the production culture at the time?
One of the things that is a kind of interesting structuring absence in her diaries is that often when she's directing, the diaries become very thin. So she will just put in like day at studio, or she won't provide the same kind of detail that she does at other points in her life, because it's almost like all her energies have to go into the job at hand. And she's suffered from intermittent ill health, and I think sometimes getting through the day's work meant that there wasn't very much left to give the diary. So actually there's less information about some of the kind of finer points of that, although you can kind of reconstruct some of it through production stills and other documents and other people's testimony. But from herself about her own, often she'll reflect back on an experience of directing after, so you get some of that, but actual like reporting at the time, there's not so much of it. And I think that's, she's a very interesting diarist. She writes a lot. You can tell that she's a kind of born writer. So when she doesn't write about things, that is also quite interesting. It's like the efforts have been channeled into another area of her life.
Yes, well, and a question that follows on from that a bit, from Polly Rose, who's a PhD researcher at Bristol. Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was intriguing to hear that Anne V. Coates was the editor on this film. Did Box work with Coates or other women film editors on other films? Does she write about their collaboration at all? And I just, if I could add also, notice in this film that Mai Zetterling is an actor in the film, and obviously went on to be a film director herself and known as a feminist film director.
Yeah, and she's in a few productions that Box had an involvement with, so it is tempting to kind of draw a connection there between, her acting career in these British films and the people she worked with and what she did later. In terms of Box working with women editors, I mean, she was always very keen to work with other women wherever possible. One of the people she worked with very frequently was the editor, Jean Barker. So, and they had a very good working relationship, also a friendship. So, in the diaries, lunch dates where they kind of they sort of swap gossip and they have a nice time chatting to each other, as well as talking about work projects, are interesting to see. Also working with costume designers more than once. So there's correspondence with the other Julie Harris, the costume designer, about do another really glamorous project so I can design some wonderful costumes for you. And Carmen Dillon, the art director. So for her earlier film, Street Corner, there's a lot of stuff in the kind of publicity material around having more women involved in production than, you know, most other examples of filmmaking that you can think of. And so there's inevitably this, oh, but did the women get on? You know, was there a lot of unhappiness? And they were able to kind of put forward this report that actually it was incredibly harmonious and everybody got on very well, and to sort of counteract some of that, you know, insinuation that women don't necessarily get on with each other. So it's definitely part of her working practices. And you know, it has to be said as well, within Sydney Box's working practices, you know, even if there is an edge of nepotism in his promotion of his sister Betty Box into a producer role, she picks up the ball and runs with it, you know, and becomes one of the most successful and important producers of popular British cinema that there's ever been. So, you know, some people are more resistant to working with women, and Box was fortunate to find allies, not unilaterally, but enough that she could kind of make her way, at least for a period.
Excellent. We have another question arriving here. Among applauses from many people who have to leave. Here there is a question from an anonymous user saying, fascinating talk, Melanie. How is the film seen within Lawrence Harvey's career as an atypical outlier?
Well, it comes from that really interesting stage of Lawrence Harvey's career where they've got him pegged as like a star, and the Wolf brothers in particular are kind of nurturing his career, but nobody seems quite sure what to do with him. And this is one of the reasons, supposedly, why perhaps British Lion decided not to publicise the film as much, that perhaps the Wolf brothers lent on them slightly, because they wanted the film The Silent Enemy, which starred Lawrence Harvey, to be the film that was presented as a breakthrough for him in terms of stardom. But to do that would entail kind of slightly dampening down the impact of this other film that he was appearing in. So some of the reviews kind of allude to this, and certainly some of the correspondence that Box received sort of suggests that this was known to be a possible factor in what had happened. So it wasn't purely they had no confidence in this woman's film. There was a bit of industry finagling going on potentially. So there's this film, but then the following year, Room at the Top, and that really, you know, sends Lawrence Harvey's career into this whole other dimension, obviously within much more of a British New Wave realist mode, but is also a platform for his international stardom to happen and to appear in things like The Manchurian Candidate, and to really have that kind of stellar career. So this is just on the cusp of that, and he's playing this kind of young blade, kind of romantic figure, but also an old man looking back at his life. The aging makeup isn't perhaps as all that it could be, but it's pretty good for the time. It's at least as good as Colonel Blimp.
Excellent. There is a question here that was also in my mind by Veronica Johnson, who says, thank you for a wonderful talk. I wonder if you came across any evidence of Box's working relationships with technical crews. So was she a tough boss, like you know, the figure of the male director was seen at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I know that with other women directors, that sense of how to command a crew of men is, you know, it's certainly one of the things that Michael Balkan thought meant that women couldn't direct films, because they didn't have that command. They literally didn't have a commanding presence that would get everybody to snap into action and obey them. Actually, Muriel Box talks about the problems and the prejudices coming far less from the crews. And she had technicians and craftspeople that she worked with recurrently on projects, and there was a kind of sense of trust and shared effort among that group of people. And she found that actually the problems with her as a woman director came more from the higher ups, the kind of people financing, and and the actors, that often actors would be very resistant to being directed by a woman, and that actually crews were not really a problem once they kind of knew you were all right, and once she'd managed to build up some experience and had a track record. Actually, that did count for something with her kind of filmmaking peers. But certainly actors, particularly women, were resistant to being directed by a woman. Even those that she worked with several times, like Muriel Pavlo, who's just said she was great, but it just didn't feel right to be directed by a woman. Other actresses put up more of a fight. I think she had a hard time with Shelley Winters, and she had a hard time with Kay Kendall. Although Shelley Winters then later said, "It's been great. I'd love to work with you again. When will you direct my next film?" So, yeah, I mean, it's all the kind of inconsistencies and paradoxes in terms of gender identity at that time, I think, that come to the fore in the way that Box relates to other people and how they relate to her, and just that anomaly that she's not what people are used to as a director, and so that becomes an obstacle sometimes.
Yeah. From the scholarly point of view, addressing you brought up the phrase of genius, the genius author of a film, the auteur, and you seem to suggest that in order to properly evaluate Box's contribution to cinematic authorship, you had to think of her within the framework of the genius auteur. And I was intrigued by this commentary, because very often when we talk about female authorship in cinema, there is a big effort towards shared authorship, which is not that big boss at the top determining every single aspect of the film according to his own inspiration, coming from the ether or something, just innate kind of knowledge of what art is and creation is. So I found it interesting. There is a certain discomfort about situating her as an auteur, and at the same time, this question that you posited in the middle of your talk, whether she needed to be framed within that kind of the genius auteur.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to work out the parameters of all of this through the process of researching and writing this book. So I kind of brought these things in as a way of, because one of the things that struck me is that Muriel Box already had a very successful career in film as a screenwriter, and before that as a script supervisor. But in spite of all the difficulties to it, she still wanted to direct films. That was her goal. And I think it's important to have an approach that kind of honors that persistence, that persistence in itself is a form of genius. If we kind of try and, as Battersby's suggesting, broaden what we understand as genius to encompass, nevertheless she persisted, that maybe is a way of opening things up. And of course everything is collaborative, and of course Muriel Box was a fantastic collaborator and co-worker, and so many of her things are done in kind of joint enterprise with various people. But at the same time, there was still this, you know, wanting to direct and wanting to direct solo. So and I think also the films are interesting, and I want to mobilize a way of approaching them that can do that. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater of auteurism, because it seems like it's so compromised in terms of its kind of masculinity and its patriarchal biases. But I wanted to see if there was something that could be kind of done with it. And in that, obviously, I'm drawing on other work by scholars around women directors and how they are approaching writing about that, with the kind of ghosts of Andrew Sarris and Truffaut on their over their shoulders, but still wanting to take the kind of good things from the development of that approach without and jettison some of the nonsense. But I don't even know whether that is possible, but that's kind of the contradictions that are in play at the moment in what I'm doing. I'm not sure I've really arrived at any particular resolution, so I'm still sort of chucking these things around and hoping that it will all make sense in the end.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned screenwriting, her career before becoming a director, because that's the next question we have here. Thanks for your wonderful talk. Could you expand a little on how Box moved from screenwriting into directing, in what context, and whether or not she had to start with short films, and how she developed her craft as director?
Yeah. I mean, her career is interesting. She's kind of like a portfolio writer in many ways. So she writes drama with Sydney Box that's performed particularly by amateur companies, because they realise that most dram companies have more women than men members, but there's not a lot of plays that have female casts. So they wrote plays that were intended to have all female casts for amateur companies to perform. And they did bits of journalism. She wrote bits of like poetry for newspapers. So as a kind of writer, as well as having this film specific career where she's working as a secretary, she's working as a script supervisor or continuity girl, as they were called at the time, working as an assistant, also in the scenario department, which is how she meets Sydney Box in the first place. She's kind of meant to look out for new projects and new writers, and she comes across something that he's written, and then they meet up, and the rest is history. So she's got this kind of broader writing and also interest in performing as well. She directs her first film, and it's one of the short propaganda films for the company that Sydney has by that time developed, Verity Films. So she makes a film about pubs, which is about kind of representing the English way of life. That's her first directorial credit, and that's available on DVD now, so you can watch that film along with others by women documentary makers around that time. But then doesn't get back into directing until 52, and in the meantime she's writing screenplays. Obviously one of them with Sydney wins the Oscar, and that becomes a kind of big landmark in their career, and it gives them leverage to do kind of more independent production. But it also gets Sydney the gig of being appointed as the head of Gainsborough Studio, and then Muriel is there as the head of the scenario department. So she's not writing all the scripts, but she's acting as a kind of script editor and trying to kind of get a lot of stuff processed, because their slate is enormous and they've got to try and gather a lot together. So I think in some ways there's a kind of clarity to that move into direction, and often directing projects that you've written or co-written, that means that she's not doing a lot of work on everybody else's stuff, and she actually gets to do her own stuff that she's more directly invested in. And The Truth About Women would be a good example of that. So it's a kind of big, messy, complex portfolio career that she has. There's some short stuff, there's some long stuff, there's uncredited co-directions where she does a scene because it needs sorting out. So the boundaries of the filmography are a bit blurry in lots of ways.
Right. We have a next question here, and perhaps we should call that one the last. It is by Lizzie Tyne, and she asks, was Box involved in any kind of feminist activities, campaigns outside of her filmmaking? What would you say were her political influences?
Yeah, I mean, she definitely has. She has involvement direct with the ACT, so the union at the time. She's involved in union activity, but she's also involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And she's also involved in an organisation whose name has slipped my mind, but is a feminist organisation. And interestingly, some of the material in the archive is written on the back of headed notepaper for this kind of women's organisation that she lobbies for and writes letters for. So she's got a kind of, it moves across the kind of broadly leftist spectrum, I'd say, of kind of feminist, single issue, sort of quasi-political. There is one point in her diary where Sydney decides to vote Liberal, and she's very annoyed about this because she votes Labour. So that's the closest we get to a kind of direct political affiliation. She doesn't appear to have been a member of the Labour Party. Obviously, later on, she's married to Lord Gardner, so she's got a kind of connection to the House of Lords. So there's a number of ways in which she's connected to large P and small p politics of that period, but it's very often filtered through a kind of feminist perspective. So when she's making a film like Good Time Girl, which is about the sort of bum deal that women get in the legal system and how kind of young female criminals are kind of sexualized in the way that they're talked about and the treatment that they receive through the legal process, that's the kind of politics that she seems to be engaged in. But there's definitely more actually belonging to things. I just can't remember it at this moment in time, but there's an awful lot of stuff in the archive, so I will remember later on, probably in the middle of the night. I'll remember the name of the group that she's in, but it has slipped my mind.
I'm not surprised. The information is now kind of fizzing out because you've been with us for an hour and a half, but actually 2 hours, because you were with us half an hour before we started this conversation. So we are immensely grateful for your time, devotion, and for sharing such precious information on a director that remains underappreciated and little known among the wider public, including many of us. So that's really precious, and I'm sure that this will sparkle the minds of many of our students and colleagues into researching more, and we eagerly await your book on the subject. Somebody is asking to make a last comment here. They are all saying goodbye and saying how lovely this conversation has been. I'll pass on to Claire.
Yes, thank you, Melanie. That was fantastic. It's great to be able to share some research in progress in this format, and we look forward to seeing how the book comes along. And yes, just apologies to all that with our little hiccup with meeting links at the start. We hope everyone was able to join us who wanted to. We had around 47 people joining us. So thanks to everyone for their support in joining and your fantastic questions. There will be a recording available on the department YouTube channel, so we'll share the links with everyone who attended and anyone who wanted to see it there. Okay, I think that's us.
Okay, have a nice end of the day, all of you, and thanks so much again, Melanie. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.